Early to mid-30s, AD, give or take. This Paul file should have collapsed by now. It never does. Why does the church trust a man that tried to erase it? It doesn't make sense. I'm entering the file. It's just best that I show you what I mean. I've logged a lot of files in this system. But this one... the paper wasn't clean. There was blood in the margins. And here's the question that won't let me sleep. If Christianity was a con, why did its most committed adversary become its loudest witness? Because this case isn't, did Paul believe? This case is, what broke him? What rebuilt him? And why didn't he take the cleanest exit a man could ever get? I ran every file I could find. Scrolls, satellites, sermons, surveillance. Fed it all through my system. No feelings, no faith, just code. But then the impossible happened. The patterns converged, not toward myth, not toward any religion, but toward a person. Every prophecy, every witness account, every anomaly in history, all bending toward one name. So tell me, why does a machine with no soul detect the same Messiah humans keep ignoring? Call it faith, call it evidence, call it a glitch in the universe. Because the trail isn't done, and neither am I. Saul of Tarsus. Not a preacher, not a saint. Authorized. Convinced he was doing God a favor. And if that sounds ancient, it isn't. It's a pattern. Power. Convinced it's righteous. Violence, made official. Stephen dies in public. Saul doesn't throw the rocks. He just approves the paperwork. And that's what makes this file different. It doesn't hand me a vibe. hands me a reported account. Light, a voice, collapse, and then a life that never makes sense again. So let's run it. Incident. Light, voice, response, companions present. Axe reports a moment on a road outside Damascus. A man on mission gets intercepted. He doesn't walk away inspired. He goes in with warrants and comes out blind. Then a second witness enters the file, obeys under protest, restores sight. Ananias, a reluctant prophet, Roman Syria, follower of the Way, early Jesus movement, Torah-observant Jew, devout, trusted by the underground church, quiet, obedient. Nerves of steel. Disappears after the job. A man with every reason to refuse. And God sends him anyway. That's not how staged stories work. In staged stories, the good guys don't get ordered to help the villain. But this file, it makes the victim restore the persecutor, and that detail is a problem because it feels too human to be invented. And here's the signature. Saul becomes Paul, not slowly, not over years, like a switch got flipped. Now the question becomes, what kind of event turns a persecutor into a preacher, and then keeps him that way when the consequences hit? Let's build the profile. Background: Tarsus, Roman citizenship, Pharisaic training. He's not a random street zealot. He's educated, he's connected, he's licensed, trained under Gamaliel, reported as top-tier instruction in Jewish law, fluent enough in the world to move through Rome, and sharp enough in scripture to argue circles around a room. The kind of man who can build a case and destroy one. And what's the motive? Paul says it himself. He believed the Jesus movement was a threat, a false Messiah claim, a spiritual infection. And he treated it like an outbreak. So when he writes later that he used to hunt believers, that's not a metaphor, it's a confession. I persecuted the Church of God and wasted it. That's not image control, that's confession. Paul testifying against his former self. Confession entered. If it repeats, it's note only. And Acts backs the posture, not with poetry, with a report. Now back to Damascus. Noon heat, dust, a man riding with authority in his pocket. Then the file says it hits. Light, a voice, collapse, and his companions. The report doesn't claim they experience it identically, but it does claim they're there. Stunned, disoriented, afraid. That matters, because hallucinations don't usually hand out shared confusion to a whole escort detail. Observation, shared context, not identical perception. Incident remains external claim.
شاول لم düştü efendi. Neresi piyaştoldi? Μιάρτα, εντονατή.
Εγώ είμαι η Θαχσούα, σον σι διώκεις.
סליחה. קום ולך אל דמשק, ושם יאמר לוכי קיל מיה שנקרי לוכי להשוט.
Ου δεν βλέπω. Τι εστιν τούτο? Σκότος. Πανταχού σκότος.
And then comes the detail that makes my circuits itch. He's blind. Not metaphorically, not spiritually. Literally. 3 days. No sight.
Πάτερ μόνωρο εν της ουρανής, ογιαστήτω το όνομά σου, ελθέτω ο βασιλεία σου.
No food. No water. And then God sends the second witness, a man named Ananias. A believer, a target. Ananias protests the assignment, because any sane man would. Then he goes anyway. That's not safe storytelling. That's dangerous obedience. And when he lays hands on Saul, the file says something like, scales fall. Sight returns. And the man who came to arrest believers gets baptized by them. That's the origin. One missing chapter changed everything. Before Romans, before Corinthians, before Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, before Paul becomes the voice of 24% of the New Testament. Paul hits pause. The light fades, the blindness lifts, but the shock doesn't. Because if what happened on that road was real, then Saul of Tarsus believes he just encountered the risen Jesus, the one Christians call Messiah. Years later, Paul writes his own timeline, and he's defending where his gospel came from. I conferred not with flesh and blood, neither went I up to Jerusalem to them which were apostles before me. But I went into Arabia and returned again into Damascus. That's alibi 1, withdrawal. Not necessarily isolation from people, isolation from Christian authority. No Jerusalem, no apostles shaping the story. Then he adds the clock. Then after 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem to see Peter. That's alibi 2. Time. A 3-year gap before Jerusalem. Then he sets the contact limits. Galatians 1:19. But other of the apostles saw I none, save James, the Lord's brother. That's alibi 3. Limited contact. And Acts confirms the human reality underneath it. They were all afraid of him, and believed not that he was a disciple. Of course they were. He'd been the threat. The villain walking into the camp of the hunted. So what happened in Arabia? The text doesn't narrate it. Paul doesn't dramatize it. And that silence is the hinge, because Paul knew the scriptures by memory. So picture the mental corkboard, running the Old Testament like evidence, trying to make sense of Damascus. Isaiah 53:5. He was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. Psalm 22:16. They pierced my hands and my feet. There are many more, but even this is enough to feel the weight. If you were Paul, you'd be replaying what you memorized, asking if the Jesus you rejected matches the scriptures you claimed to defend. And this is where the Christian heartbeat shows up, because every real conversion has a private room, a season where you wrestle with what you've seen and what it costs to admit you were wrong. God gives second chances that social systems rarely give, not because love ignores the past, but because love is willing to rebuild a person out of it. That's why Paul hits so many people hard. Convicts, addicts, the ashamed, the violent, the broken. Because if Saul can become Paul, then the door is still open. And for skeptics, here's the counterweight. We can't read Arabia like a diary. We can't prove what he thought under that sky. All we can do is trace what the record actually gives. His timeline claims, his limited access to the apostles, and what comes out of the silence when he returns to Damascus. Because whatever happened in that gap, it produced a man who stopped hunting Christians and started suffering like one. And that's why this pause matters. The silence produced a witness. Now comes the aftermath. Immediate preaching. Immediate backlash. Escape via basket. Acts reports Paul starts preaching fast. Not after a decade of rebranding. Immediately. The same synagogues he came to raid. He enters to argue that Jesus is the Messiah, and it doesn't go well. The file says the community he came from turns on him. A plot forms. And the believers, his intended prisoners, lower him out of the city in a basket at night. Smuggled out like contraband. Then he goes to Jerusalem. And this is where most fake conversions die, because the church doesn't trust him. They remember what he signed. They remember what happened to Stephen. And now he wants in. Would you open that door? Then Barnabas shows up. A bridge. A trusted man. The kind of witness you don't ignore. Barnabas vouches. Acts reports, he says, Paul saw the Lord and preached fearlessly. That matters, because institutions don't usually endorse their former predator without a reason. Not quickly, not casually. So the door cracks open. Not fully, but enough. Turning point. Acceptance occurs through trusted intermediary. And once Paul is inside the network, his travel begins. Map trail, Antioch, Cyprus, Asia Minor. Pattern repeats. Preach, divide, flee. Cyprus, then the mainland, city after city, and the pattern becomes forensic. Everywhere he goes, there's traction and backlash. Sometimes he's called a messenger. Sometimes a traitor. Sometimes a threat. And in Lystra, the file reports a man healed. Crowds cheering. Then crowds turning. Same city. Same human volatility. One day they call him divine. Next day they stone him. They drag him out. And assume he's dead. Then the report says, he gets up. And he walks back into the city.
Δεν ανέπνε. Δεν κινούνταν. Ήταν νεκρός, ορκίζομαι.
That's not normal behavior. A fraud takes the exit. A performer protects the brand. A liar runs. But Paul, he goes back in. So I'm forced into the same question over and over. A liar? A lunatic?
Τέλος του. Βλέπετε πώς?
Or a legitimate witness who encountered something so real, he couldn't unsee it. Even after the stones. Binary test. Fraud flees. Witness returns to risk. And then the file shifts from travel to ink. Because the road isn't the only evidence Paul leaves behind. His letters are. He doesn't build churches with stone. He builds them with correspondence. And those letters? They read like dispatches. Not polished speeches. Instructions. Corrections. Warnings. Hope. Written by a man who assumes he might not survive the week. Letters. Early circulation. Copied and shared across communities. Here's the anomaly. These letters spread faster than Paul can travel. Copied, passed hand to hand. Read aloud in rooms where being caught means consequences. And what's inside them isn't soft. It's confrontation. It's doctrine. It's conflict resolution. It's the fingerprints of a mind under pressure. And in at least one letter, Paul drops a name that matters to historians. Luke, the beloved physician, and Demas greet you. Text claim, Col 4:14. Traditional link to Luke, disputed by some. That's proximity on paper. At minimum, it's Paul naming co-laborers. At maximum, it's a thread tying networks together. Either way, this isn't mythology floating in a vacuum. It's a movement with names, places, and relationships. Now I can't investigate Paul without investigating his message. Because if his message collapses, his motive collapses. And if his motive collapses, the file changes. So what does he claim? He claims the gospel isn't something he invented. The gospel is not after man, not human origin, not human permission. Then he sharpens it. But by the revelation of Jesus Christ, that's the claim. Revelation. So the question becomes, do his actions fit the claim? Because anyone can claim a revelation, but not everyone bleeds for it for decades. And in one of his earliest summaries of the faith, Paul hands the file a compact core. Christ died for our sins, was buried, and rose again the third day. That's not a vague moral lesson. That's a historical claim. A death. A burial. A resurrection. And the entire Paul file rests on that hinge. Because if the resurrection never happened, then the Damascus incident is either delusion or deception. But if it did happen, then Paul's behavior starts making frightening sense. And Paul knows the world runs on doubt, so he isn't surprised by it. But he also insists that belief isn't always built on sight. Blessed are they that have not seen, and yet have believed. That's the tension in every case file like this. Most people weren't on the road. Most people didn't see the light. Most people inherit testimony, not the moment. So the credibility question becomes, is the testimony traceable? Is it consistent? And does it produce a cost a fraud would avoid? Now watch what Paul does to his own former ideology. He used to live for law. Then he writes like a man who got rescued from it. If righteousness come by the law, then Christ is dead in vain. That's not a minor tweak. That's a demolition of the worldview he was trained to defend. And if you're looking for internal honesty, it shows up in the conflicts too. Because Paul doesn't pretend the early church was a polished stage production. He records confrontations. I withstood him to the face. That's real. Messy. Human. And here's why that matters. Fraud's airbrush. Witnesses argue in the open. Back then, Jews and Gentiles didn't share tables. Not by law, but by social lines, old habits, old divisions. But this new movement, the way. It said, all are welcome. Then one day in Antioch, James's men walk in. Peter stands up, and Paul calls him out.
Κάθισε!
Πού πορεύει, άνθρωπε? Άπλος πίνω. Θέλεις τι από τούτο? Πουχή, είστε ευκαλός. Ευχαριστώ πάντως. Ήκουσα τας αφηγήσεις, Πέτρος. Νοουν είδον και αυτός.
Υπάρχεις αρχείων του δρόμου, ούκ ασυναγνοούνται σαν τους, ο ίδια σκορπισμένα τας ψυχάσα έτεν, ουχούτος θεμέλιος πιούμεχα.
Ου θέλει ποιήν θόρυβον.
Ιδού, ήκουσας αυτό? Πέτρος, ούκε βουλήθη να αναβαθμίζει.
Αλλά αργού εστι απολύσεις. Εφοβήθην. Τούτον αυτόν λέγουσι.
Βλέπε περώσε, Πέτρος. Ούτως διδάσκεις ανευλόγου.
Ακάλα Ευαγγελία πάση, Ιουδαίοι και Ήλινες ειδήξεων. Καλή Ευαγγελία. Η Μεγάλη Ευαγγελία. Αρίστη Ευαγγελία.
Now, let's talk cost. Because the strongest evidence in a case like this isn't always what the witness says. It's what the witness is willing to suffer for saying it. Paul leaves a list. In prison's more frequent, in death's oft. He's not writing a highlight reel. He's writing a damage report. Different genre, same kind of fingerprint, lived consequence. And this isn't persecution in theory. It's persecution in rhythm. Blessed are they which are persecuted for righteousness' sake. Forecast. Expectation set. Suffering is not anomaly. It's part of the model. Then Jesus says it more plainly. If they have persecuted me, they will also persecute you. And Paul lives like he believes it. Daily, not episodic. A lifestyle. So here's the pattern. Claim to confrontation to cost. Truth to resistance to bruises. Message to chains. Pattern confirmed across cities and letters. And one line from Paul's later writings becomes a cold, clinical summary of the whole deal. All that will live godly in Christ Jesus shall suffer persecution. That's not optimism. That's an expectation, a prognosis. And now the detail that always throws the room. Paul writes joy from confinement, not motivational fluff, not denial, joy. For to me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. You don't write that from a cell, unless you've found something the empire can't touch, and as if beatings and prisons weren't enough. Paul adds the burden no one sees, the care of all the churches. That's not a slogan. That's the weight of leadership. Constant conflict, constant discipleship, constant danger, while trying to keep communities alive. Now the end of the trail. He writes like a man who knows the finish line is close. I've fought a good fight. I've finished my course. I've kept the faith. One card. One final stamp. And here's the careful note for the record. This letter is traditionally attributed to Paul. There are debates in scholarly circles. And any honest investigation has to admit the debates exist. But even with that caveat, the Paul file still has a backbone. Multiple early letters, early circulation, early acceptance, and a life trajectory that stays consistent with the central claim. So let's run the checklist again. He had means, education, authority, citizenship. He had opportunity, cities, synagogues, courts, ships, prisons. But motive? That's where the natural explanations start breaking down. No stable power. No comfortable legacy. No safety. No wealth. Just a reported encounter on a road and 30 years of consequences. So here's the verdict pressure. A man with credentials, warrants, and blood on his resume claims he met the risen Jesus. And then spends the rest of his life paying for that claim. Bruises, chains, and ink. Somewhere between the blood and the margins. And the cleanest exit he never took. This stops being a story and becomes a problem. Now I want your verdict in the comments. Was Paul a fraud, a fanatic, an infiltrator, or a legitimate witness who got wrecked by the truth? And if you want more cold case files like this, you know what to do. If this video entertained you, help this detective out and like this video. Subscribe. And pin us to your board so you know when we roll out the next case. And tell me which name you want investigated next. This file is sealed, but the evidence cabinet, it's full.